Let us start with disaster management. अभी तक जितना डिजास्टर किया आपने ज्योग्राफी में उन सबको मैनेज करते हैं, ठीक है? See, your syllabus doesn't say much in terms of the syllabus. If you read for your mains thing and PT thing, it doesn't read much about disaster management. There are just few lines given. It says disaster and disaster management. यही रख दीजिए, इसकी ज़रूरत नहीं है, वहाँ रख दीजिए टेबल, शुक्रिया. So it only reads disaster and disaster management paper 3 after your environment syllabus, right? So because the syllabus doesn't give you much, you have to get a sense of what they have asked you in disaster management in the last few years, just to get an idea, right? Let us see these questions from the past, all the questions, right? And wait for some more, just one more week, less than a week, and probably you will get this year's question also. Okay? So this is it. These are the questions they have asked in disaster management in this year, right? So it reads the first one. Can you see? Visible? This is a 2011 question. That was when disaster management was not mentioned in your syllabus explicitly. They mentioned it in 2013, but when they revised the syllabus and the pattern, but they did ask you a disaster management question in 2011 as well, right? Which was the first question? 2011, composition and functions of National Executive Committee, also called as NEC. So what is the composition of the NEC and the functions of NEC of the NDMA? NDM authority, NDMA we call it as. Right, so this was the first question, very straightforward. What are the functions and what are the compositions? So what all does it comprise of, and what all it is supposed to do, right? Straightforward kind of a question, because that was the first question on disaster management that they asked. Then in 2013, once they gave the syllabus, in the syllabus, once they mentioned disaster management explicitly, after that they asked this question: how important are vulnerability, risk assessment for pre-disaster management? So first of all, what do we mean by pre-disaster management, and then what is the importance of vulnerability and risk assessment in pre-disaster management? That was the first part of the question. Second part said, as an administrator, what are the key areas that you would like to focus on in disaster management system? So this is where they intend to ask you that आप अगर हो तो भाई disaster management में which are the areas where you would like to focus, right? So for that you need to first of all know what are the areas, key areas of disaster management. पहले तो वो पता होगा तब तो key area में focus कहाँ करना है, that you will be able to zero upon, right? So you need to know which are the key areas of disaster management, right? So, and then depending on the suggestions you can give the focus areas where one should focus, okay? Then 2014, so if you see this, there are some conceptual parts. This question is completely conceptual to me, right? With some recommendations here and there, but mostly conceptual, because they are clearly asking you what is meant by vulnerability, risk assessment, pre-disaster management, key areas of disaster management. So you need to understand the concepts of disaster management in this, right? And then next year, 2014, they ask, drought has been recognized as a disaster. So drought as a disaster, right? Because of whatsoever factor that they have mentioned. So drought is a disaster with a focus on September 2010 guidelines from NDMA. So what are the guidelines from NDMA? Is what with respect to drought. So as of now, NDMA has 22 plus guidelines for different disasters. This was the first year they asked a question based on the guidelines of disaster management, right? So do we need to know all the 22 guidelines, different guidelines which are there, which are important, what to focus on, right? Now read what the question says. With a focus on September 2010 guidelines of NDMA discuss the mechanism and preparedness to deal with likely El Nino and La Nina fallouts in India. Okay. Now, just to give you a hint of how vague even this question is, I'll show you something. Yeah.
So here, do you need to explain the spatial expense of drought or El Nino and La Nina?
See, listen, read the question yourself. पढ़ो क्या लिखा है.
View of its spatial
Drought has been recognized as a disaster in view of spatial expanse. So how much wide it is, temporal duration. So what is the duration over which it falls, slow onset and lasting effect on vulnerable sections. So because of all these factors, drought is a disaster. This is what they are saying. One. What is the question? This is a statement they have given. कि भैया drought is this because of these factors. Now, what is the question? With a focus on September 2010 guidelines from NDMA. So there is a guidelines from NDMA on this, which they published in the year 2010 September. Right. Discuss the mechanism for preparedness. So as per this guideline, discuss the mechanism for preparedness to deal with likely El Nino or La Nina fallouts in India, which means that this guideline should have something about El Nino and La Nina, right? And the relation of droughts and El Nino and La Nina. So what is the likely fallout of a El Nino La Nina? वो आप बताओ with respect to this. Okay. This is what they asked. Now, just to, as I said, just to give you a hint of what they have stated in this question, right? Let me show you a, right? So see this. I hope you can read this. I don't have it right now downloaded. It will take me some time to download. This says the September 2000 guidelines of, can you see? What guidelines is this? Right? So this is the NDMA guidelines. Okay. This is a PDF document. In this PDF document, let me search you the word El Nino. Right? Assuming that if at all the word El Nino occurs in this document, it should be searched. Okay. The only place it searches this word in the whole document is in the forward. Right? And in the forward, there is just this line. Read this. What does it say? Pado. Okay. However, failure of rains from southwest monsoon results in occurrence of drought in Indian region. Also, there seems to be a clear association between El Nino and La Nina events and weak monsoon. That's it. In the whole document, they have mentioned only this much about El Nino and La Nina. तो अगर आपको ये पूरा डॉक्यूमेंट याद भी है, रटा हुआ है आपने, like विवेकानंद, still you will only be able to recall in the exam hall that in the forward, in the second paragraph, at one place, the word El Nino and La Nina is mentioned. Do you get it? There is no other place in the whole document. I hope you can see there. It doesn't show an arrow, which means the word does not reappear in the whole document. ठीक है? So I hope you get a sense of, अगर पूरा रट भी लिया 22 का 22 guidelines, तो भी कितना, and the total number of pages in this guidelines, only this one guidelines is around, कितना page है I don't know, written, कहाँ दिख रहा है, लिखा हुआ है, pages, okay, so 16 out of 108, so 22 मतलब approximately 2300-2400 pages के guidelines हैं. ठीक है, घबराने की बात नहीं है. ठीक है, तो ये बता करके what I intend to say is, it doesn't mean that ये question किसी ने attempt नहीं किया या आप नहीं कर सकते हो. What I want you to understand from this question is that with focus on this guidelines, from this discuss mechanism for preparedness to deal with this. So from the whole guidelines, you only need to understand what is the level of preparedness that we intend to do. And in case of El Nino, La Nina, don't think, अरे यार ये document तो मैंने पढ़ा ही नहीं. Right? This is just to give you this hint. That in the exam hall, if you come across anything where they mention a document, don't think that यार अगर वो document I have not read does mean that I don't know. right? Because even if you have read the document, still it doesn't mean much, right? So what you need to know is that the basic concept should be clear with respect to disaster management. What is to be done in case of preparedness? You know, the other aspects. What do I need to do? If you know what you need to do with respect to disasters, you can apply common sense, and only those things will reappear in any of the documents, which you can see. Okay? So don't be, afraid just because a factual term has been introduced or any document has been introduced or anything. You can still attempt a question, you can still expect some marks. Okay? This is all I need to tell you with respect to this, right? So,
It's not directly as the failure of monsoons causes drought. That's about the effect of El Nino and La Nina. How the failure of monsoon.
so this is where you have to mention first of all that how is El Nino La Nina associated with monsoon first of all. Those documents we have written with IMD. याद है हमने लिखा है उसके बाद you have to associate okay even if it is a failure then what is the do you get so ये implied question है okay so there are two levels of implication in this which you need to apply first of all what is the relation and second if at all what is whatever the relation is then what is the steps that you need to okay then come to the third one 2015 frequency of earthquakes appear to have increased in Indian subcontinent. This is what they are already clearly saying कि हाँ भैया frequency of earthquake has increased, right? Then, however, India's preparedness for mitigation of the impact has significant gaps. Discuss. So first of all, do you agree that frequency of earthquakes have increased? So some of you will feel yes, yes, sir, because of global warming, climate change, earthquakes have also increased. But keep in mind, earthquake is never affected by global warming or climate change or El Nino, है ना, या corruption. ठीक है these things do not affect earthquake thankfully ठीक है earthquake has its own set of causes right what is the cause why has earthquake increased if at all first of all you have to say increase मतलब क्या ऐसा है कि last 20 years में ज़्यादा earthquakes are coming or last 100 years we had more earthquakes
Amount of damage is more.
what do we say here The frequency of earthquakes appear to have, they clearly say appears to have. Right? They are not saying it has increased. They are saying it appears to have increased. Okay? When you say appears to have increased, you have to look at the factual that has it increased, one in terms of number, and second, why does it appear to have increased? Both. Appear to have also means that you seem to be looking at it more, with more focus than what you were doing earlier. Maybe an earthquake of a smaller scale in a remote area was not earlier marked, right? But nowadays we don't leave any earthquake, even if it is of the scale of 3 or 4 Richter scale. So first of all, you go on figuring out every earthquake that happens. One. Second, you also have human-induced earthquakes of smaller scale, which have increased obviously because of our faulty mining practices, faulty reservoir practices. Those have increased. Right? This is where human interference has affected earthquakes. Right? Third is their influence or effect has increased because the increased population density. Okay? Earlier we had more area which was not covered. Nowadays you have everywhere human population has increased to an extent that even a small earthquake goes on to create more disastrous effect. Right? So this is what you say, and then you come to that, yes, with respect to all these, the preparedness has been missing. But then you have to know what is meant by preparedness with respect to earthquake. Okay? So you have to understand what are the angles of preparedness, what are the different types of preparedness that you need to have. Then you have this year's question. This मतलब ये बोलते समय आवाज आ रही है क्या है? जेब में डाल दें ऐसा जुगाड़ okay so then you come to 2016 the frequency of, so again you have frequency of urban floods is increasing, right? So basically what you will find it that there are lot many things frequency of which are increasing, right? Why? One is because of human interference. Second, obviously because of the indirect causes of human interference, right? So frequency of many of the things are increasing, but don't always think कि frequency increase मतलब हमेशा हम ही घुस गए बीच में. ठीक है? There are other causes also, right? Discussing the reasons of urban flood. So what are the reasons of urban flood? Highlight the mechanism of preparedness again, right? Preparedness to reduce risk. So you have to understand preparedness and risk again. So what you find is that in the last three questions, every time they have asked you preparedness, right? And to understand preparedness in all the three questions, they are asking you every time preparedness. You have to understand what are the various things around preparedness. What makes you prepare? Which are the things that you prepare for? Okay, all those things. If you know these basics, you can write an answer. Even अगर आपने document वगैरह नहीं पढ़ा हुआ है, okay?
Can we include case studies over here? Like
You can include anything, anything. No one stops you. Freedom.
because preparedness is not much of the topic, no? How
No,
to get the content?
wait करो. अभी तो class start भी नहीं हुआ है. Your friend is giving you the answer. हाँ थांबा, एक आज नहीं आया है. हाँ, वो आएगा तो सर बताएंगे. So with respect to NDMA guidelines, discuss the measures to be adopted to mitigate the impact of recent incident of cloudburst. So you also go on marking which all disasters have they prepared and which all disasters they have asked. Hopefully the disasters that they have asked might not reappear in near future, which means 2018 तक इनका chance थोड़ा कम है. 18 के बाद 19-20 में maybe again they might again start digging these, but for the next year probability is less because we have so many disasters. India is one of the most disaster prone country in the world, right? जैसा हमारा most हर एक चीज में we are the most populous, we are the most notorious and disaster prone everything. So here also reason being population इतना यार हर जगह भरे हुए हैं, ठीक है? थोड़ा भी जमीन हिल गया तो 150 साफ हो जाते हैं. Okay, so this is your cloudbursting. So they have asked you cloudburst, they have asked you urban floods. I will tell you which all disasters they have not asked. In the end, we'll list that out, right? And they have asked you earthquakes and they have asked you droughts. ये चार अभी तक पूछ चुके हैं आपसे, right? So hopefully you can spend your time on other disasters to start with and then be prepared with these as well, okay? And obviously the questions in these would be next time slightly more complex than whatever they have asked, right? So be prepared slightly at a higher level. So this is it. This is the question. These are the questions that they have asked you in terms of disaster management till now, right? Having this background, let us start with disaster management as a topic. Right? Abhi to we were just seeing which are the questions they have asked. So you can put the heading as disaster management. Obviously you must have put by now disaster management. And let us start with what all is to be covered in this. So initially we are starting, I've shown you the syllabus, I've shown you the questions. I hope you understand to what level you have to be prepared here, right? So let us start with the topic disaster management and let us start with let's start with the theory part of the story, right? And then we come to international aspects and then we come to national aspects, right? Which you need to include in your answers. So in theory, we will talk about what is risk, what is assessment, all these things. Okay. So first of all, I would like you to write down 3 words, the meaning of which I would expect from you, in case you can just think and say, right? Write down these words. One is hazard. Next is vulnerability. third is risk, and lastly disaster. ये 4 words हैं. Just write all of them and then let us discuss one by one. What is meant by all these? So what is meant by a hazard?
cause destruction.
Abnormal event which has the potential to cause destruction, such as these are all hazards. और क्या है? Any other thing? Epidemics, floods, droughts. What else? सिंपल भाषा में क्या है hazard? ठीक बोला आपने, but what is? How will you simply explain what is meant by hazard?
Large scale damage or
Something that has
potential to cause a
potential to cause large scale damage. Large scale is not necessarily not large scale. Okay. So something which has a potential to cause damage का मतलब क्या है? Everything has a potential to cause damage, isn't it? I take this pencil and throw it into someone's body. Even this has the potential to cause damage. Is this a disaster hazard?
Abnormal event.
Abnormal event.
Natural event.
Natural event, abnormal event. So abnormal natural event. Huh?
The artificial also.
Artificial. So abnormal, natural और artificial event. और कुछ? मतलब कुछ एग्जाम्पल भी आपने दे दिया. यू आर राइट. घबराने की कोई बात नहीं है यार. दिस इज इट. राइट. सो इवेंट, एनी इवेंट विच हैज द पोटेंशियल, राइट, लिख लो एक एक लाइन में. मे बी यू कैन राइट one line definition of what is a hazard. It is a occurrence, not only an event, but it's an occurrence having the potential of causing. It is an occurrence which has the potential, and potential is something that you highlight. It has only the potential, it has not caused. Okay? It has the potential but has not caused. It has the potential of causing injuries to life, injury to life, or damage to property. Life means the biotic component, and damage to property means the abiotic part. Right? Or the environment in which the biotic and abiotic coexist. Has the potential of causing injury to life or damage to property or the environment. Right? And in many cases it can be anticipated or estimated. So what are the different types of hazards that you have? Right? If you have to list the types of hazard will mean one, geological hazard. आप लोगों ने एसी वेसी बंद किया हुआ है क्या? ठंड हो रही है ना? मुझे भी ऐसा ही फीलिंग हो रहा है. हेमंत सर, टेम्परेचर हाई कर दीजिए, मे बी 28. ठीक है? ओके, कम बैक. So what are the types of hazard? One is you can have hazards related to land, right? We call them as geological hazards, right? Hazards related to land, also called as geological hazards, right? Which include phenomena such as earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes. These are all geological. Right? Earthquakes, tsunamis and volcanoes, which are all endogenic Can it also include exogenic processes such as mass movements? किया था ना हमने mass movement, and in that we had rapid mass movement such as landslides. Remember debris avalanche, right? So you can write it includes endogenic such as earthquake, volcanoes, tsunamis, and exogenic such as rapid mass movements. Huh? Meteors are not geological, but yes, you can still write. Matlab, yaar, it is, you are right, right. Even that is a disastrous situation where a meteor falls and it can create an earthquake or it can create, you know, something. हो सकता है. But that is very, very rare. Okay. Okay. Then write down exogenic में you have written hopefully landslide, rock slides, rock falls, avalanches. Even an avalanche is included in this only. Avalanche, surface collapse. You might have seen surfaces collapsing in urban areas, right, which turns into a hazardous situation, right? So even a surface collapse, road collapse. Today in Hindu front page. आज था 2-3 दिन पहले था. तीन हाँ bridge collapse. ठीक है, not today. हाँ, so all these are examples of geological, ठीक है, hazards. Then you write hydrometeorological. This is the second type. Hydrometeorological. Hydrometeorological. What is meteorology? Study of the climate, weather conditions, right? It is primarily the study of weather conditions, meteorology. So hydrometeorology means weather related aspects, not climate. Climate is a long term thing. Okay? It is a weather related. Hydrometeorology such as floods, cyclones, storm surges. I hope you remember what was a storm surge. In which case do you get a storm surge? Tropical cyclones in the coastal areas bring storm surges. Okay? So storm surge, then thunderstorms and hailstorms. What do hailstorms affect? Crops. Okay? Thunderstorms and hailstorms. Blizzards, drought, desertification, wildfires and mine fires, extreme temperature conditions, sand and dust storms, and also avalanches. Avalanche is also a hydrometeorological event. It is a geological event. An earthquake can cause an avalanche, and an avalanche could also be caused by hydrological, or so heavy snowfall can cause an avalanche. So can a meteorological condition also cause a avalanche, right? Such as high level blizzards and all, they can also cause, right? Then you have anthropogenic hazards. Anthropogenic, man caused. Right? Which includes technological hazards, mostly due to exposure. What is a technological hazard? Radiation exposure and all, right? Which are accidental radiation exposures. Right? Or mercury exposure, right? Volatile materials, mercury, etc. Asbestos, fibers, fibrosis and all, right? You have various types of this thing, right? Coal dust exposure. Then we also have pollution related, such as acid rains. Yes, acid rain, because it's mostly caused by human action. Mostly, right? It is either transport related or it is industrial, this thing. Okay. So H2SO4 and this thing you must have done. Okay, industrial and transport related pollutants, right? So then you have
Coal dust is also a transport related pollution.
not necessarily, coal dust could also come from mining activities.
Basically, it comes from the transportation activity, pulverization.
Pulverization of coal into what?
Why
Transportation. So that's what I'm saying, mining and related transport. Mining and transport not as a fuel, but transport of coal. Okay. So these are, and then global warming and climate change also is your anthropogenic hazard. For example, I think 2-3 दिन पहले ही there was this newspaper article which said that the largest number of deaths due to pollutants happens in India. So that is an anthropogenic hazard. ठीक है, front page पे news था. You must have seen. So these are anthropogenic hazards, right? Man-made hazard. We are turning the situation hazardous. During Diwali, we turned the situation hazardous. You need an air purifier in many cases, specifically people who are suffering from various, lung related or breathing related disease. So अभी से ही उनका air purifier बेचारों का चालू हो गया. So these are hazardous conditions that we create. Okay. So these are your hazards. I hope you get the sense of what all is included in hazardous situation. Then comes the next word, vulnerability.
So, anthropogenic hazard, reservoir induced seismicity is also there.
Come again. Reservoir induced seismicity, obviously वो anthropogenic में डाल दो. ठीक है, वो हो गया, माइनिंग हो गया, बहुत सारा है, जितना भी हमारा earthquakes है उन सबको इसमें डाल दो. Man made earthquakes. Okay. Then you come to the next point, which is vulnerability, second term. ठीक है. What is meant by vulnerability? Susceptible to attack or damage. Anything which is susceptible to some kind of harms which could be induced to itself. Right? It is susceptible to being harmed. Right? This is vulnerability. Right? So you can write down a one-line definition that vulnerability is the characteristic. It is the characteristic or the circumstances, either characteristic it is or it is the circumstances of a community, system or asset characteristic or circumstances of the community, system or asset that makes it susceptible to the damaging effect or harmful effect of a hazard. ठीक है. So it includes three things, not only community but also systems or assets. One. And secondly, it is not only always the characteristic, but it is also circumstances which can make you vulnerable. For example, let us say you are a tourist, right, from a very geologically stable region. Let us say you are a tourist from the Deccan region of India, right, and you go to Iceland and you are on the top of a volcano and that's when it explodes. Okay? So it's not your characteristic to be vulnerable, but your circumstance that you were present at that time at that given place makes you vulnerable, right? So it's also circumstantial. It's not always characteristic of anything to be vulnerable. I hope you get this. But fishermen's could be, you can say fishermen could be, that's a characteristic of the community to be affected by storm surges or Tsunamis, right? So we generally say that in case of a tsunami or a storm surge, which communities do you inform first? The communities which have a characteristic to be affected by the vulnerability. In that case, one of the first community that will hit your mind will be fishermen. Yeah, fishermen ko bata do who are at sea that please come back, isn't it? So that's where it becomes a characteristic. Okay. Then, which are the different types of vulnerability we need to understand? Once you understand what is vulnerability, then types of vulnerability. Okay, so let us write down the types. First is your material or economic vulnerability, and these are the terms that you should almost remember for almost any answer, because when you are saying preparedness, what do you prepare for? Or your vulnerabilities. So if you are able to recall all these vulnerability in the exam hall, right, you can write an answer around the preparedness or as per all these vulnerabilities. Okay, so that's why I'm focusing so much on these areas, because this is where the questions have been asked. Right, to understand preparedness, you need to understand what is hazard, what is vulnerability. Then only you will be able to give a preparedness answer. Otherwise, your answer will become very random. जो दिमाग में आएगा लिख दोगे. But if you focus one by one, all the points will be taken care of. Okay. So types of vulnerability. The first is economic or material vulnerability. What do I mean by economic or material vulnerability? Right? In which case will you say that economic or material vulnerability is high? Yes, it is a resource scarcity. Right? Economic or this vulnerability is mainly because of, you can write, inadequate resource availability. Inadequate resource availability.
Proper management also.
So, but basically economic and material will mostly be improper management ultimately leads to inadequate resource availability. Okay? So you call it mismanagement, you call it maladministration, whatever, but ultimately it leads to this. Okay? So we are writing the outcome, not the causes. Okay? Directly what is the outcome, why it is caused, economic, material, right? Then second is your social vulnerability. Social vulnerability. What is meant by social vulnerability? Society is
Society use type of vulnerability.
such as
Seeing evils in the society, bad practices, traditional, traditional wrong practices.
traditional wrong practices.
Advancement, differential advancement of different regions.
Okay. Hmm. Hmm. Unequal distribution और बोलो, निकाल डालो मन की सारी भड़ास. हाँ, जो जो सोचा है. हाँ. Don't forget that you are talking of a vulnerability during a disaster. You are not writing a general answer on social ills of the society, gender inequality, foeticide. डिजास्टर में कोई फोर्टिसाइड नहीं कर रहा होता. ठीक है ना, मतलब समझो बात को. ठीक है, तो क्या है सोशल, मतलब सोशल इनइक्वालिटी क्या हुआ? What could happen from the society which can make you vulnerable during a disaster?
For example, tribes, they are so much
Confined.
confined to that particular area. They don't want to leave, even if the government tell them that a disaster is about to come there also.
So is that a social vulnerability? Does the society cause that vulnerability to the community?
Basically,
Tribe ko?
responsibility of administration, like in floods,
Hmm.
mitigation is not done properly, like in floods.
But is that a social response, social vulnerability?
Regardless
सोशल कैपिटल नाम का एक वर्ड होता है ना? सोसाइटी हो गया आपका. व्हाट इज मेंट बाय सोशल कैपिटल? कैपिटल डिफरेंट टाइप के होते हैं ना, राइट? यू हैव ह्यूमन कैपिटल, यू हैव इकोनॉमिक कैपिटल, सेम वेज यू हैव सोशल कैपिटल. व्हाट इज सोशल कैपिटल? What is a capital, by the way? A capital is a resource, right? In the first one you wrote economic vulnerability is where your economic capital is inadequate, right? So when you say social vulnerability, what is lacking? Your social capital lacks, right? Now what is social capital?
Meant for the people, all the people.
Meant for all the people, but economic capital is also meant for all the people. Social capital में आता क्या क्या है?
relation between the people.
Interrelation, very good. It is the interrelation between the people. How the society comes together to resolve a problem, right? In economic problem, how the money is utilized to resolve the problem. In case of a social problem, how does the society come together to resolve a problem? This is called as social capital. Okay? So social capital can take different forms, right? But how does a society become vulnerable? Very simple example. You might have heard that in the case of a riot, when one community riots with another community, or let us say even let's leave aside riot. In case of a protest, right? When a community goes on to protests against the government, right? A given community, ABC, is protesting against the government. In that event, the local people are tortured, the females are misbehaved with. Are they part of the government? Is this what the protest should be doing? You get it? Let us say if you are traveling on the road and your bus meets an accident, okay? And you find 10 people come, they take away all your baggage, they take away your wallet and let you die. Okay? Is this how a society is supposed to behave? Right? It has nothing to do with gender bias or anything. Do you get this? So this is what you mean by social vulnerability. That how does a society behave in case of a disaster or in case of a hazard? Right? The behavior of a society, does it come together to resolve that disaster, or does it use that disaster as a means to fulfill their selfish agendas? Do you get? This is what your social vulnerability is. So any society which is not behaving properly during a disaster so as to resolve that disaster, right? You would expect that males should come together, right, and do whatever is expected. The female should come together and do whatever is expected, right? The old age people should come together and do whatever is expected. But if they do not use themselves as a means to resolve, this is what is meant by social vulnerability, right? So what it simply means is, you can write it in one line, that social vulnerability is when the society disintegrates. When the society disintegrates during a hazardous situation. Which means you can't trust your society or your community itself during the disaster. Right? Where the trust between the community or within the society disintegrates. People do not trust others. Okay? For example, you might not be willing to pass away, let us say it's a very bad food condition, and you might not trust your neighbor ki jaakar ke aap, you tell him ki jaake mere bacche ko de dena, and he might not give it. Right? So this is a social vulnerability, that you don't have trust. You get it? This is what we mean by social disintegration. I hope you get this simple thing. So the society disintegrates in the face of a vulnerability, or sorry, in the face of a hazard. Okay. Then you come to ecological vulnerability.
So vulnerability is susceptible to damaging.
So it has the potential to damage. So when the society you cannot trust, this situation itself has the potential to damage. You might have ample resources, right? But you might feel if I give this money to him, he might not pass it on, but he might stock it. The way you have black market, stocking of any food grain during a bad situation, right? So black marketeers do this. So this can turn into a disaster situation, right? When the society disintegrates, the hazard will turn into a disaster because of this particular social vulnerability. It has nothing to do with the resource. It has to do with the trust in the society. Okay? I hope you get this, right? Third is ecological vulnerability. देखो, inadequate, this thing would mean something like, let us say, if you require, let us say there has been a tsunami, right? And food is required on the coastal areas, right? But let us say food available ही नहीं है. So that is a economic or material vulnerability, that it is not available. Social vulnerability will mean that food is available, but you cannot trust your own people that they will, distribute it and utilize it in a most optimal manner. So this is social vulnerability. Okay. Then ecological vulnerability will mean disintegration of the environment. Disintegration of the environment and inability to protect. Disintegration of environment and inability to protect it. क्या मतलब है? Deforestation, for an example. Let us say a region is flood prone. The forests in the region act as, we have read, they act as micro dams. They slow down the water, and in that way they ensure that the water percolates down and it does not have too much of surface runoff. If the surface runoff is less, the flood will be less. But if you cut down all the forest, right, deforestation kar diya aapne, right? So what have you done? You have disintegrated the environment. What will be the outcome? That soil erosion will be high and the flood might also become more intensified because the speed of the water will be higher. ठीक है? And it might flood up a region much faster. So this is your environmental vulnerability, right? It is not material, it is environmental vulnerability where you have disintegrated the environment and you don't have the ability to reverse it. अब आप एक ही दिन में तो पेड़ लगा नहीं दोगे, ठीक है? Even if you have a short notice कि महीने भर बाद flood आने वाला, you can't do much because you have already destroyed it. ठीक है? So it is something like this. Okay, right? Then fourth one you can write organizational vulnerability. And for all of them you need to add preparedness measures. ठीक है? So next is organizational vulnerability, which means lack of, what will it mean? अपना पहले खुद दिमाग लगाओ. हाँ? Lack of coordination. Coordination किसके बीच में? But सबसे पहला स्टेट और ऑर्गेनाइजेशन तो होना चाहिए. कोऑर्डिनेशन तो बात का बात है. When you say organizational vulnerability, what does it mean? It means that the organization itself is not there. Let us say you have a fire and the DM says, यार फायर ब्रिगेड को बुला लो. वो बोले सर है ही नहीं. ठीक है? तो क्या बोलेगा? अच्छा नियर बाई डिस्ट्रिक्ट से बुला लो. बोला सर 5-6 डिस्ट्रिक्ट में कहीं भी नहीं है. अब क्या बोलेगा? पाइप ले आओ. ठीक है? बोलेगा सर पाइप भी खरीदा था, गल गया. अब क्या करो? बाल्टियां ले आओ. Do you get it? So this is your lack of organizational, right? So what it's very simply, देखो, I've just given you a very random example. What it means is lack of required organization. Organizations are not efficient or non-existent. They are either non-existent or they are, if at all they are there, they are not efficient. ठीक है? Non-existent or not efficient. So lack of organizational structure, especially at the grassroots level. You might have a fire department in the capital, ठीक है, but आग तो capital में नहीं लगी है. You get it? By the time it will come from the capital, you will have nothing to save, right? So this is what it means that you should have it at the grassroots level. This is what you need to highlight. But because disasters happen at grassroots, they do not happen at center. Okay? So you need it at the grassroots level. Everywhere it should be, organizational structure should be strong at the grassroots. Okay? Then write down next, educational vulnerability. Educational vulnerability. What will this mean? Lack of education मतलब क्या? पढ़ना नहीं आता? हाँ, lack of awareness, right? Lack of awareness with respect to that disaster, right? Or also lack of education could simply mean that people are not, let us say you being a disaster DM, you said okay yaar, everywhere put a notice in English and this language that this disaster, during this disaster you do all these things. But you realize that 90% of the people are either illiterate or not literate in the language in which you have put the banners. ठीक है, इंग्लिश में डाल दिया, सब हिंदी वाले, so yeah, whichever way, right? So that becomes a educational thing that you might say, हाँ सर हमने 10 करोड़ रुपए का बजट बनाया था, 9 करोड़ का पोस्टर छाप के लगा दिया. ठीक है. All of you are so confident of the system that you start laughing the moment I say such things. ठीक है, कि क्या करना है सर, उसमें से 9 करोड़ में से कितने का पोस्टर लगाना है, ठीक है. But I hope you understand. So this is a complete loss of, right, resource because people are not aware. Or let us say that you, okay, you say नहीं छापेंगे नहीं, हम अनाउंसमेंट कराएंगे. आपने रिकॉर्डिंग करके मंगाया सेंटर से इंग्लिश में, ठीक है, और लोकल लैंग्वेज में आता नहीं है लोगों को इंग्लिश समझ में, तो वो बोलेंगे जरूर कोई पिक्चर का अनाउंसमेंट हो रहा है, राइट? लेटर ठीक है. I hope you get this. So this is what we mean by educational. One, educationally they are not okay, and secondly the lack of awareness. So they might be educated enough, but they might not be aware. That's why we are introducing disaster management into your school curriculum and other things, so that people are aware. You might have seen in your schools you have those boards, है ना, वो earthquake आया तो क्या करना है. I told you last time, 3 step. ठीक है, get down the table, put something on the head and hold the table. ठीक है ना. तो अगर आपने 3 में से 2 ही प्रोसेस याद कराया, ठीक है, get down the table and put something on the head और hold the table बताना भूल गए, तो क्या होगा? Table will go somewhere else. ठीक है. So people have to be rightly made aware. ठीक है. So this is your awareness thing, that what is to be done during, or let us say you forget to inform that during an earthquake please don't use elevator. अब आप लोगों का आदत है जब कोई देख नहीं रहा तो बटन दबाओ चढ़ जाओ, ठीक है. डिजास्टर भी आया, बटन दबाया चढ़ गए, लिफ्ट आधे में गया, हिल के रुक गया, अब क्या करेंगे? Do you get? So you have to be aware that which measures you should use, right? You have to have all the, so this is what is meant by educational, this thing, right? Awareness as well as education, both, right? So vulnerability in terms of insufficient access and knowledge. Next, attitudinal and motivational vulnerability, right? Attitudinal and motivational vulnerability. What is meant by attitudinal and motivational vulnerability? If you start panicking, or so the situation might, if you let us say very right, that during you will find this kind of a thing mostly happening when you have stampedes, right? So during a stampede, the major cause is that people start to panic, right? They might panic. मान लो किसी ने कहीं चिल्ला दिया बम है, अब असली में बम है नहीं, लेकिन बम के नाम पे 10-20 मर गए. Why? Because they panicked. Do you get it? So, right? So simply this is one simple example, but attitudinal vulnerability means something much more than this. Right? This is during a disaster, but attitudinal and motivational vulnerability would also become important with respect to how do you perceive a disaster. Right? For example, everyone in Delhi knows that Delhi is a earthquake 4 zone, right? For which you need to have your architectural reinforcement in your building so as to ensure that the building does not, or the building is able to withstand the given level of earthquake. But if you actually see technically, less than half the buildings in the city might be earthquake prone, including our building. Okay? What could be the possible cause? एक तो आई कैन सी योर घबराया हुआ चेहरा. ठीक है सर, व्हाई डिड यू से आवर बिल्डिंग? ठीक है, बट डोंट वरी, इवन आई एम देयर विद यू इन दिस बिल्डिंग. तो हाँ हाँ, स्टिल वी विल हैव. अच्छा सर, आप भी साथ मर जाओगे. हाँ, सो दैट्स व्हाट आई एम सेइंग, दैट व्हाई डू वी हैव दिस? डू यू नो? Right? Why do we have this kind of a thing? Because people do not have an attitude towards, they have a motivational or attitudinal, orientation, which makes them think कि कोई बात नहीं यार, earthquake तो 20 साल में एक बार ही आना है, guests तो रोज आने हैं, right? So let me make the house good for guests so that my impression is right, right? जाना तो सबको ही एक दिन है, ठीक है? So whenever the earthquake comes, हम भी चले जाएंगे. But if the guests, so basically you will find they might spend lakhs of rupees in decorating the house. It's not material vulnerability, right? It is not even educational vulnerability. सबने पढ़ा है. Everyone is aware that what level of this thing you have, but people are not willing to invest. Now this willingness, lack of willingness, is what you call as motivational or attitudinal vulnerability, right? The lack of willingness to act is there. Okay, so the lack of willingness. All of us know that environmental pollution or pollutants or patakas will do whatever in Diwali, but you have a lack of willingness. हम सोचते हैं हम फोड़ लेते हैं, ठीक है, बाकी नहीं फोड़ेंगे. ठीक है, और you give this, अच्छा यार 4 साल से नहीं फोड़ रहे, क्या हो गया, इस साल फोड़ लेते हैं, ठीक है. But this is your, I hope you get this. So this is a lack of willingness that makes us vulnerable, right? So attitudinal will be, you can write it in one line: low level of public awareness, low level of awareness, as well as desire, right? Low level of awareness as well as desire to change, and more importantly desire, willingness or desire to change.
Government employees की भी, authorities की भी such attitude.
हाँ, you can say that they have attitudinal or motivational vulnerability. For example, the government says you do a mock drill and involve whole of the community, but the officers might come and just say हाँ हाँ please आ जाओ, उसके बाद खुद जा कर के रेस्टोरेंट में खाना वाना खा के and go back, right? So that is a lack of motivational or attitudinal. So we don't have. I don't know how many of you participate in any mock drill, including me. राइट, वी नेवर पार्टिसिपेट. मॉक ड्रिल होता है तो हम खड़े होकर हंस रहे होते हैं, देखो बेवकूफ़ों को क्या कर रहे हैं. है ना? वाई? बिकॉज वी थिंक हमारे साथ अर्थक्वेक नहीं आएगा, उन्हीं के साथ आएगा. ठीक है. सो दिस इज द attitudinal or motivational aspect. Okay, then you have political vulnerability. Political vulnerability, which means, what will political vulnerability mean? Political will, and political will on one side. Second, lack of political representation. Okay, many people or many set of communities do not get prepared, or they have a high vulnerability because they are not represented well. Okay, so lack of political representation or access to power. access to power or political representation also makes or brings in political vulnerability. ठीक है? Then you have cultural vulnerability. Next, cultural vulnerability. We are writing different types of vulnerabilities at one place, which we will try to address at the latest. Right? So next is cultural vulnerability. What will this mean? What is meant by cultural vulnerability? Socho?
The practice which people cannot adopt while disaster is.
Come again?
The practice which people cannot adopt.
Practice which people cannot adopt in?
Disaster.
Practices which they cannot adopt during a disaster because of their culture. Such as? कोई example दो?
Practices which make them more vulnerable.
अच्छा, so let us say you say that non-vegetarian food is available and they might say हम तो vegetarian है, भूखे मर जाएंगे, लेकिन good enough. What else? The tribal thing in terms of, okay, so the tribals are not culturally, they say that we will not move out of this region, whatever the circumstances. Good enough. What else? Cultural vulnerability. और कुछ सोचो. Is there anything in our culture which makes us prone to disasters? Anything that we do on a regular basis which makes or which increases the possibility of a disaster? That is also cultural vulnerability, na? Which makes you accessible, makes you prone. जैसा कि, for example, very simple example I'll give you. In a specific community in India, when they die, I won't take the name because most of us belong to that. When they die, with them 3 trees also die. Right? Why? बिना लकड़ी के स्वर्ग नहीं मिलेगा. ठीक है? So when we die, with us, we ensure that 2-3 पेड़ तो साथ लेके जाएंगे. ठीक है? लगाया एक भी नहीं था. When a child is born, we don't have a, any this thing, ritual that please plant 3 trees so that when he goes or she goes, the trees would be there. Right? But ले जाते समय everyone wants at least one. कुछ को चंदन पे भी जाना है. ठीक है? So this increases the vulnerability of the society as well as the region to various disastrous situations. Then I'll give you another example. I hope most of you know there is a festival, and I have nothing against that community, right? Ganesh Chaturthi, name suna hoga, right? When does it happen? Around monsoon, right? And what do? We go and ensure that Ganesh ji को डुबा के आएंगे. ठीक है? और उसके साथ 2-3 खुद भी निकल जाते हैं. ठीक है? Right? Because the level of water is highest at that part of the year in the river. ठीक है? Almost. ठीक है? If I tell, अच्छा यार 4 महीने बाद डुबा लेना, पानी कम होगा. No. How can you change the date? The Ganesh ji must be ensured to be dipped on that given day. है ना? Otherwise he might become angry with me. I hope you get this. So we have many cultural practices which make us vulnerable, and most of the people who go are educated. It's not that they are not educated. They very well know कि अभी कौन सा part of the year is there, and every year you have so many announcements, right? Same ways, you must have heard of that Uttarakhand flash flood, right? Which part of the year do we ensure that we go there at least to put water on? Which month? Sawan. Right? पूरे साल पानी नहीं डालना है. सावन में जाके जरूर डालना है. ठीक है? When the level of rainfall is highest. ठीक है? That's when you crowd that place and flood it up. with human being, and any normal flood will also become disastrous. How can you expect local people to be ready for thousands of tourists at that given part of the year? You get? Because the community will not, the administration might not even prepare, or they might not be aware of influx. कि इस साल इतने आ जाएंगे. Do you get? So these are the challenges that you have in terms of cultural vulnerability. Okay, so your culture also makes you vulnerable from various aspects. Okay, so then you have physical vulnerability. Lastly, right? Physical vulnerability, which means weak buildings, as well as physically weak and vulnerable people. Physically weak or vulnerable, not only weak, but vulnerable. And for being vulnerable, you don't have to be weak. You just might be not be fit enough. For example, if you tell me if I'm on the top of a 10th floor building and an earthquake comes and you tell me please run to save your life, I might say nahi yaar, nahi bhagunga. Because if I run 10 floors, I might die of other causes. ठीक है? So physical fitness is an important aspect in ensuring what? Reducing physical vulnerability, right? A population should be ensured to be physically fit so as to reduce the physical vulnerability of the population, including the structures, right? So structure is one part and the people is the other part. Okay.
Like the old age and the children.
Obviously, old age, right? But in old age, you can still say that is weakness to some extent, right? Children, I won't say because children will run. Infants, so obviously infants might be the case, right? Or women, especially in villages where migration is a major issue. So if let's say if there's a cyclone, so the women are left to take care of the other vulnerable. They themselves might be fit enough to run. I told you last time also as an example that they themselves might be able to save their life, but if you ask them to run with the child and the old age, in-laws or parents, then it becomes difficult, right? So these are some of the physical vulnerability related aspects. Okay? So these are different types of vulnerabilities which hopefully we have listed. So any disaster, now let us say if you are talking about an earthquake, I hope you know how do you fit in all these vulnerabilities. Whereas if you have a disaster such as a drought, you can again fit in all these vulnerabilities and approach the answer in terms of preparedness. Okay, na? So just ensure that you don't forget these vulnerabilities because they only decide what is the level of risk. They decide what is the level of preparedness required, what measures need to be taken, suggestions, सब कुछ आपके in vulnerability के around है. ठीक है? So from the vulnerability thing, let's come to the next word. Next word क्या है? Risk. What is meant by risk? ठीक है? So risk is equal to, we can write risk into an equation, right, which is hazard into vulnerability divided by okay. So risk is a product of the hazard and the vulnerability, right? And the lack of capacity, right? So you can say that the risk will increase when will the risk increase? All the three. Risk is one side of the equation. So even if you keep out of these three variables, if you go on changing the other variable. How? Let us say vulnerability is same and you just increase the level of hazard. Then the risk will increase. Or let us say the hazard and capacity are same but the vulnerability is increased. Still the risk will be high. And let us say if hazard and vulnerability both are, but the capacity is reduced. So again the risk will increase. So when you say that the risk has to be, there were two questions that we saw which talked in terms of risk assessment and risk management. So when you're talking of risk management, you have to attack the question or handle the question from the perspective of the hazard. What could be done with respect to the hazard? This should be your first approach. Then what could be done with respect to the vulnerabilities? And then what has to be done with respect to the capacity? If you handle this from these three perspectives, any question related to risk could be handled. Okay, so the moment you come to a question mentioning risk, आपके दिमाग में ये तीन बत्तियां जलनी चाहिए. Right? What is the capacity? What is the hazard? And what is the vulnerability? Okay, and which are the types which are involved? For any question, we are doing a broad arrangement for every type of hazard disaster related question. Whichever disaster they ask, you just apply these, and your answer will be broadly framed. Okay. So let us write down the definition of a risk. Right? Risk is the expected loss of life, property, loss of life or property, or disruption of socio-economic or other important activities. Or other important activities. Right? So either the disruption or the loss or damage. So loss of life or property and all, or the disruption of socio-economic activity. These are all the risks that we can broadly think of. Then we come to the next word. So I hope you understand the risks. So whenever you are talking of risk, take up all the vulnerabilities, take up all the hazards, and you can write an answer around it. Right? Then come to the disaster. Fourth word. Right? What is meant by disaster? So what is a disaster? Good, well remembered. पढ़ के आया है? नहीं? ये कहाँ से निकला? आत्मा की आवाज मतलब आत्मा में भी बुक का इंफॉर्मेशन पड़ा हुआ है. ठीक है, यू आर प्रिपेयर्ड फॉर यूपीएससी नाउ, है ना? बोल सकते हैं. जब आत्मा भी बुक की लैंग्वेज में बात करने लगे तो समझ जाओ कि कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन इज बाय हार्ट. ठीक है, दिल की आवाज भी बाय हार्ट वही निकल रही है. वेरी गुड. सो गुड, राइट? दैट इज द डेफिनेशन. सो लेट अस राइट डाउन द definition of disaster as per the DM Act. The definition of disaster as per, there are two definitions we write. One as per the Disaster Management Act of 2005 and the other as per United Nations. Right? So there are two definitions given. First let us write the Indian definition and then we write the international definition of the term disaster. Okay. The first one says disaster is a catastrophe or a grave occurrence, from a natural or man-made cause, by accident or negligence, resulting in substantial loss of life, damage to property or environment, and is of such a magnitude that it is beyond the coping capacity of the community affected. Okay, now you have to highlight some words in this. First, it is the occurrence. It is not neither the potential, it is the occurrence itself. That when you say disaster, it has happened. Right? So it is the occurrence of what nature? Natural or man-made, due to accident or negligence, which results in loss of life, damage to property or environment. Okay? And finally, we call it disaster when it is beyond the coping capacity of the community. Matlab the community in itself is not able to cope up, at least in the short run. Right? Then we call such situations as a disaster as per the Disaster Management Act of 2005. How does United Nations define this disaster management? Right? So as per UN, disaster is, they have given a very short definition. Good. It is the occurrence of sudden or major misfortune. It is the occurrence of sudden or major misfortune which disrupts the basic fabric and normal functioning of the society or community. Okay, now we have written this much. Now let us write down what are the causes. First of vulnerability and then of disaster. Okay, the causes of vulnerability, what makes a society vulnerable, and then what makes the disaster happen. So causes of increasing vulnerability. What you find globally is that the level of vulnerability is increasing, right? What are the possible causes of increase of vulnerability? Write down. First, what do you think will be the first simplest cause? Population increase, right? We have made ourselves available at so many places that now we are vulnerable to anything. ठीक है? क्योंकि कोई सा भी जगह हमने छोड़ा नहीं है, right? So it is the population increase, right? So one is population increase, especially the distribution at relatively hazardous places. What does this mean? As population increases, it goes on to enter into regions which are otherwise not recommended for any human activity. ठीक है, तो हम वहाँ पे जाके रहना शुरू हो जाते हैं. We go to volcanic areas, we go to earthquake prone zones, we go to drought prone regions, right, into the riverbed region, right? So we go on entering all these regions and make ourselves vulnerable. One. Second, environmental degradation. Environmental degradation, mostly due to anthropogenic causes. Mostly due to anthropogenic causes, such as what activities of our make us the environmental, huh? तो इसमें you always think in terms of the activities that you have learned. ठीक है, सबसे पहला activity क्या है? Dependence on forest. After that, agriculture. After that, mining. Then manufacturing. Then transport. ठीक है, then urban areas. Right? So this is how you have to think. Think in that sequence, starting from forest dependence. So what do? Earlier we were using less of the forest, but gradually we have deforested for wood and other things. Then agricultural practices. Okay, what have we done there? Again deforested, slash and burn, over irrigation, right? Reduce of biodiversity. Okay, so all this will add up there. Okay, go on adding in your own terms. You add up. I believe even if you don't write it right now, you get a sense of what all has to be incorporated. Overgrazing, etc. Then mining, so faulty mining practices, they make us vulnerable. Yes or no? Right? Then overuse of groundwater, urbanization, right? Faulty urbanization practices, land use is faulty, right? Land use practices. Okay. What happens because of this? We have higher frequency of floods, higher frequency of droughts, higher frequency of landslides, etc. Okay. Cyclones, landslides. Those cyclones are not directly affected because of our activity, but the storm surges could be, because we go on to cover more of the coastal areas, and coastal areas are prone to storm surges. So all these activities make us this thing prone, right? Third is increased industrialization and urbanization. Increased industrialization and urbanization. How do you think this will make us prone? What has industrialization done to our economic activity? Not power. How has it made a bigger community vulnerable? What policy? Urbanization and industrialization both have done one thing to our earlier practices of rural living and agriculture. What is it? Concentration. Both of these activities, industrialization and urbanization, have increased human concentration, right? Agriculture does not require us to be concentrated in a region, right? It is rather distributed, right? Agricultural economy will find itself well distributed. Similarly, a rural system will find itself well distributed, whereas industrialization makes you concentrate in a given region, right? And if that region becomes prone to something, the whole population becomes prone to that. For example, the Bhopal gas incidents. Okay? If so many people were not living around it, those people might not have been affected. Okay? So this becomes a simple example. I've just given you one example, right? That urbanization as well as industrialization makes us concentrated, and the higher the industrialization and urbanization, the higher will be this thing. Okay, do you get? So this is how your vulnerability is increasing, and this is where you can quote that nearly half of the global population in the last 100+ years has become urbanized, and the pace at which industrialization is increasing is also high. So ultimately more and more people will become vulnerable.
सर सारे थोड़ी होंगे जैसे इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन कंसंट्रेट करते हैं जो एरिया वल्नरेबल आप कह रहे हो उसमें
What I'm saying is, देखो, let us say you have this zone, ठीक है, and people are distributed in this whole zone. Let us say only a part of it gets affected, ठीक है, right? Then the other regions will not be affected and people will not be affected. But because of industrialization or urbanization, it might happen that people from that area as well as other area might come and live in that given space. And urban spaces or industrial spaces become more vulnerable, if not from natural, at least from man-made disasters. Man-made disaster कहाँ होगा? जहाँ लोग रह रहे हैं, वहीं पे तो हम डिजास्टर कर पाते हैं ना. ऐसा तो है नहीं कि हम रहते हैं यहाँ और राजस्थान में जाके डिजास्टर करते हैं. I hope you get it.
At the concept of urban heat zone zone.
Urban heat zone is one part. I'm saying various disasters. It could be biological, it could be radiological, it could be any. Okay? So you can have many type of disasters. So urbanization and industrialization are also a cause of increasing vulnerability. Okay? Then next, you can write the poor condition of people in such areas. Poor condition of people. Poor condition of people in such areas. Okay, for example, if you have very heavy rainfall in urban areas, देखो, rural area you might have flood, but in urban area what are the challenges? You have urban floods, you have collapse of buildings. Why? Because people are impoverished, they don't have much money and they are compelled to live in conditions which are not safe. Okay, so that makes such communities more vulnerable, especially the impoverished community. They become more vulnerable, especially the slum dwellers and others. They become more vulnerable to disasters in such conditions, right? Then next is again cultural practices. They also increase our vulnerability. Cultural practices, right? Diwali is a best example, right? We go on to burn so much of crackers, especially at a time when the weather conditions do not allow it, right? Had Diwali been celebrated somewhere during summer, we would not face so much of trouble. So let us at least decide that ठीक है यार, पटाखे फोड़ना ही है तो दिवाली गर्मी में मना लेंगे. But no one would agree. ठीक है ना? Because the date would, you can't change the date of some of the cultural practices. Okay, so this is how cultural practices also make you vulnerable. Okay, then you can write next, gender inequalities. Gender inequality also makes you vulnerable. One example I have given you, dependence on female, especially in rural areas where migrations are high, right? So the females are supposed to take care of the other vulnerable community, which are the children, infants and the old age. The males might not be available in the rural area, right? So they only have to take care of the other vulnerable. They themselves might be fit enough to escape, but might not escape because they have to take care of the vulnerable, right? So this is where gender inequality affects. And mostly migration in rural area is mostly with respect to the working male population. Female population migration is generally less in rural areas, right? Working age population. ठीक है? नहीं समझ में आया? What I'm saying is that let us say, मान लो there is a coastal town, coastal village in Odisha. You find that out of 100 male and 100 female, 90 males have left, migrated for work because it is not available. Normally the migration is of males, not of females. They do not go. So 10 males, 90 females, 50 old age and 100 children are left, right? So in case of a disaster, on whom lies the responsibility to take care of the old age and the children? The 90 females. ठीक है ना? Because and the 10 males. So obviously the gender inequality here. If we had a equal gender migration, then this won't be the case, right? But equal gender migration doesn't happen. We have a very unequal kind of migration or other practice, right? So this is something that, or even in a general village, let us say males have gone to the farm to work and female is at home. and all of a sudden you have an earthquake. So who has to take care? Male तो बेचारा farm में है, उसको तो भागना है नहीं, ठीक है? And by the time he will reach, disaster might have already happened. So the female only has to take care of the old age, right? So this kind of gender inequality in our social systems make it vulnerable. Okay. Next is wars and civil unrest and war. They also make civil unrests and wars also make regions vulnerable. ठीक? How? What could be the cause? Civil unrest or lack of lawfulness, mass destruction, weapons. जॉर्ज बुश के जैसा बात नहीं करना है, हाँ? नॉर्मल ह्यूमन बीइंग के जैसा बात करो यार. अमेरिकन प्रेसिडेंट का एग्जाम थोड़ी हो रहा है. वेपन ऑफ मास डिस्ट्रक्शन, मतलब छोटा फेंकना है पहले. सिविल सोचो थोड़ा, मतलब दैट्स व्हाई आई एम सेइंग थिंक. सोच के बोला था सर, यही दिमाग में आया. हाँ जी, हाँ, resources are diverted. Okay, what else? How can a war affect disaster management, or let's say a civil strife or a civil unrest or other internal security conditions can affect disaster management? Destruction of rehabilitation, good. Disruption, that is also good कि हाँ भैया disrupt कर दिया आपने. For example, let us say there is a cyclone in a for example, if I give, let us say there is a cyclone in a Naxal affected area, right? You might not find the the community or the government machinery willing to go and take measures there, right? They might be threatened for their own life, right? Or you might find that the infrastructure has been so much damaged that it could not be utilized. रोड उड़ा दिया, मान लो साइक्लोन कल आया, आज ही रोड उड़ाया था, ठीक है? तो अब रोड ही नहीं है, ठीक है? So one day में तो you can't lay the road and go, right? So such conditions make, for example, let us say in northeastern parts of the country, especially let's say Manipur and all you're talking of. So let us say there is some challenge, but such conditions in the internal security situations might not allow the local community or the government machinery willing or able to take measures. Okay, until unless whoever has created those internal security measure voluntarily say कि ठीक है 10 दिन तक आपको नहीं छेड़ेंगे, जो करना है कर लो, ठीक है? They do that, right? In case of any civil unrest region, or let us say in many regions you will find Jammu and Kashmir or in northeast or in Naxal affected areas, you will find that they voluntarily announce, ठीक है, next 10 days there is a we would not affect or we will not interfere, you take measures, ठीक है? So these are the things which go on to affect during a war situation. Or let us say you have a border war with Pakistan, उसी समय earthquake आ गया. So जो भी हम आपस में लेन देन कर रहे होते हैं in terms of okay we will support you or I will support you, that will not happen. You would not say कि अभी war के अंदर we will allow 100 people from your side to come. You never know who will come, ठीक है? So these kind of situations affect the normal disaster management and increase the vulnerability. So any region where you have war or civil strife or internal security challenges, those areas are vulnerable to disastrous conditions, okay? Because people might not be willing or you might not have the required machinery or infrastructure so as to act, okay? Then you come to next one, public awareness lack, we have already written, okay? Then lack of proper preparedness and planning. Lack of proper preparedness, planning. And lastly, neglect of developmental issues. Neglect of developmental issues. And lack of integration of disaster preparedness in developmental planning. Lack of integration of disaster preparedness in developmental planning. Right? That also makes you vulnerable. What does this mean? For example, the government decides that okay, in Delhi we will build 200 bridges. Right? That's a developmental project. Or the government decide, for example, that the way they have decided that we will build pillar-based metro system. Okay? And they might build multiple bridges in the whole city. Right? But why? So this is a developmental program. But they forgot to integrate the disaster preparedness with respect to earthquakes in the building or in the bridges, right? The pillars or things which carry this thing. So what will happen in case of a disaster? Right? Your developmental itself becomes a disastrous situation. So this is how developmental activities, if they do not integrate the disaster preparedness in themselves, might make the region more vulnerable. Right? The government might make a 50-floor building, right? And the building might not comply with the norms, bylaws. So it goes, right? So this is what we mean by disaster preparedness. If it is not integrated in development, it might lead to, more increased vulnerability. Okay? So these are some of the factors. Last, you can write lack of bylaws or their implementation. Lack of bylaws or their implementation also increases vulnerability. First of all, you have not created the required bylaws. If at all you have not created bylaws, they become a cause of vulnerabilities. Or even if you have created bylaws, if you do not ensure their application, that also makes the region vulnerable. Right? Delhi and the construction in Delhi is one of the best examples. Not only Delhi, many such regions. Right? The illegal construction in most of the urban area is the best example of this, which has increased the vulnerability with respect to most of the disasters. Right? Then finally, from this we come to the next word, which is disaster management. What is meant by disaster management? Let us understand, and the various aspects with respect to disaster management. So what is disaster management? Let us define it first. Right? So as per the Disaster Management Act of दो का I didn't get कौन सा वाला cause? हाँ. So first we wrote, the first one was for the vulnerability thing, right? The disaster also you can write, but most of them are common. But you can still write the causes of disaster. This is also mentioned in your crisis management wala report as well as the NDM policy 2009. So the causes of disaster also, causes of vulnerability you have written, right? So you can write the causes of disaster also, right? Which are somewhat similar. You can write the first is poverty. Poverty which compels people in vulnerable zone. The causes of man-made disasters are following. Causes. First is poverty which compels people into vulnerable regions. Second is population growth. So you will find many of them are common, right? Population growth, which again compels people into vulnerable region. Then rapid urbanization, forcing people to live in disaster prone regions. For example, if you see regions in southern Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh and some parts of UP, they are not as disaster prone as Delhi is. But people are compelled to live in Delhi. right? Because of the urbanization in Delhi, many people from these regions which are less disaster prone, they have shifted to a more disaster prone region, right? So that is how urbanization goes on to affect. Okay, then you can write moving away from agriculture centric economy to industry centric economy. Moving away from agriculture centric economy to industry centric economy. ठीक है? So what can you suggest for this? इसके लिए भी लिख लो अगर लिखना है here itself. कुछ सोचो क्या कर सकते हैं? How can you ensure that even development is taken care of, but at the same time people do not move from complete agriculture to complete industry? What could you decentralization of industries, right? Decentralization of or distribution of industries, one, and promotion of your agriculture based industries, right? Agro industries, processing industries, cottage industries, right? So that people are not compelled to come to urban areas. जैसे हमारा रूरबन मिशन है, ठीक है, RURBAN, रूरल अर्बन मिशन, right? We call it as the Rurban mission, right? Or programs such as Pura, providing urban amenities in rural areas. Okay, so these are some of the suggestions that you can give with respect to reducing this industrialization or complete industrialization or urbanization, people moving from such areas. Next is environmental degradation. Environmental degradation, which is the same cause, right? Environmental degradation, and lastly the lack of awareness about the bylaws. Lack of awareness about bylaws, rules. Okay, so from there you know all these four terms. Now let us come to what is meant by disaster management. So disaster management, let us directly write the definition. It itself will give you what it means. This is the disaster management definition as per the DM Act of 2005. Disaster Management Act 2005 defines DM as a continuous and integrated process. Continuous and integrated process planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary to prevent any disaster. Planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary to prevent a disaster or reduce risk along with capacity building and preparedness. Capacity building or preparedness, assessing the severity or magnitude, of any disaster evacuation, rescue, relief, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. ठीक है. So what does that last set of words mean? क्या क्या लिखा है? Assessing that severity of magnitude of a disaster, evacuation, relief, rescue, relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction. क्या मतलब है इसका? The first part means that what all it includes. Second means also evaluating that what will be the effect of these actions. ऐसा ना हो कि you, let us say there is a disaster, right? And you know that in 2 hours you will have a cyclone, and you panic yourself and you evacuate the region in such hurry that that evacuation itself turns into a disaster. ठीक है? So even this can happen. So during a disaster management, you also have to plan that what will be the effect of the rescue, relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction activities that you will do. So even that evaluation is part of the management itself. Management does not mean taking actions only. It also means assessing the effect of actions taken, right? So that the action itself doesn't turn into a wrongful action. Okay? So all these, first taking the action and second assessing the effect of those actions. All of this together is, as per your DM Act, the definition of a disaster, right? Now what all does disaster management include, right? So let us write down. Disaster management includes, and we are writing what it includes as per this act. ठीक है? As per this act, what it includes: first, reduce the risk, and I'll just give you the key terms, not the whole sentence. They have given long sentences around it, right? So just the key term: reduce the risk. Next, provide required assistance. Provide required assistance both before and after a disaster. Provide required assistance. Next, rapid and sustained recovery. Rapid and sustained recovery and rehabilitation. Okay, so these are the things that it achieves. Now, what are the focus areas of disaster management? Focus areas include preparedness in advance or preparedness before disaster. Preparedness before disaster. Second, participation of all stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders in case of a disaster? Just for the sake of knowing, let us see what do we understand. हाँ? सबसे small stakeholder कौन है? Individual. ठीक है? So the individual or the system or the asset. ठीक है? At the level of living, it is the individual, and at the level of others, it is the asset or the system. ठीक है? That is the smallest stakeholder. Which are the other levels of stakeholder? So from individual it becomes the community, right? After the community it becomes the administration, the government at the district level, the state level and the central level. Okay? So including all the stakeholders, and if possible we also include the regional and the international levels, because there could be international measures which could be adopted as best practices. For example, if you want to learn how to best mitigate earthquakes, you can depend on the information we can collect from countries such as Japan. If you want to learn which is the best method to overcome an avalanche, in that case Japan might not be very helpful. In that case you might have to depend on countries such as US or USSR or Europe. Do you get? So different disasters you will depend on different countries or different regions, and best practices might be there to adapt. Okay, so all that coordination comes under this. Okay, so you have to involve all the stakeholders if you want the disaster management to be well coordinated, right? Then next you can write technology upgradation, technology upgradation, and deployment, technology upgradation and deployment, right? So you have to continuously improve the technology application in case of a disaster management. Okay. Next, information as a tool, using information as a tool. Simple examples, right? The committee to review the disaster management, PK Mishra committee, said that, for example, they said that the Gujarat model of disaster management is very good, right? Or last year, the NDMA itself said that the Bombay model of disaster management taken up by Mumbai can be taken up as a role model. So this is where such models, what you have to do? You have to disseminate that information to other regions, that what good practices are they adhering to, right? So this is what information, sharing of information helps in terms of disaster. So you can write information as a tool to disaster management. So you have to share the information available. Next is understanding the link between disaster and development. Understanding the link between disaster and development. We have slightly discussed it earlier, right? How you have to understand that whenever you do any developmental activity, how disaster itself should be, or disaster management should be integrated into that. Otherwise your development itself might become disastrous. Okay? So this is your understanding the links between them. Next, connecting specific programs. Connecting specific programs for management of natural disasters. Management of natural disasters. Can you think of some examples here? We have Rashtriya Krishi Sinchai Yojana, right? Where can it be integrated? Drought prone management, right? Or drought management, right? Similarly, we have Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Where can it be? Let's say if you guarantee गांव के लोगों को employment देना ही देना है, so how can you integrate it in disaster management? Reduce urbanization, चलो ठीक है, but how can you ensure that whatever they do turns into disaster or helps you in disaster preparedness? Let us say if you are in a cyclone prone region, so you can employ them or give them projects to build cyclone shelters. ठीक है, उन्हीं को एम्प्लॉय कर दो यार, ठीक है, आप जाओ साइक्लोन शेल्टर ही बना दो, ठीक है, राइट? और एवलांच शेल्टर और फ्लड रिलेटेड थिंग्स और व्हाटएवर, राइट? और बंडिंग, right? So you can, this way you can incorporate your programs, your developmental programs, you could be tuned towards attaining the goal of disaster management. Okay, that depends on how you see it. Okay, so this, next you can write forecasting and warning about disasters using latest technology. And Lastly, forecasting and warning about disasters using latest technologies. And lastly, considering disaster management as a continuous part of developmental planning. Considering disaster management as a part of disaster planning. Developmental planning. Okay. Then come to the next part, which is types of disaster or ways of managing disaster. Ways of disaster management. Right. So in what all ways do we generally tend to manage various disasters? So one is your traditional or conventional approach to disaster management. Right. These are approaches or ways of disaster management. Right. So let me write it here. Approach to disaster management. Approach or ways of disaster management. The first approach is a traditional conventional approach. Traditional conventional approach. What is done in this is it is mostly post disaster. Post disaster. The traditional conventional approach to disaster management is mostly post disaster, also called as relief centric approach. It is a relief centric approach. Okay. What does it do? It waits for the disaster to happen. Once the disaster happens, then you go on to provide the relief. Okay. So the government says, जब तक नहीं आ रहा तब तक ठीक है. Because this is where you consider the disaster as a exception. This approach considers disasters as exception. Right? It doesn't consider it to be a natural event or doesn't consider it to be a regular event. Okay? It just considers it to be a exception and considers that there is no need to be prepared for this. You just have something, and once it happens, then you go on to take the measure, give relief to the people, and then the disaster is over. Okay? Hence we call it as relief centric approach. It only focuses on relief. जब होगा तब देखेंगे, relief दे देंगे, that's it. Right? So प्रधानमंत्री will say हम अपना फंड से जो मरे हैं उनको इतना, जिनका एक टांग गया उनको इतना, जिनका दो टांग गया उनको इतना, ठीक है, जिनका दोनों हाथ और टांग गया. So depending on, they will announce that. Okay? So this is your relief centric. Okay? Then the second approach is, and it does not focus on pre-disaster anyways. So it does not prepare for the disaster. Right? It does not broadly prepare. Then you have the second one, which is a progressive approach. Progressive approach to disaster, which focuses on risk reduction or risk reduction centric. Right? The progressive approach, which is risk reduction centric. Now, once you say the word risk reduction, what comes into play? First, the word risk itself. And once you have risk, what do? What all three things that we have to think? Hazard, vulnerability, and capacity. So when you talk of risk reduction, what are you talking of? Risk. This thing is risk reduction. Yes or no? And how do you attain this? Sorry. Hazard, vulnerability, and capacity. So how will you reduce the risk? We have discussed. Okay. First, what do? You see if the hazard itself could be reduced or taken care of. Right? Second, you reduce the vulnerability, and third, you increase the capacity. When you say this, increase capacity and reduce vulnerability, this is your preparedness. Preparedness. Okay? So you are prepared for this. And when you say reduce the hazard itself, this is what you call as mitigation. Okay? Mitigation. Which can include either you try to completely eliminate the hazard, right? Or what you call as prevention. Either you ensure that you are able to completely prevent that hazard, right? But not all hazards could be prevented. For example, you cannot prevent a earthquake. Drought आप फिर भी थोड़ा मोड़ा control कर सकते हो, right? But you can't prevent a earthquake, right? Nuclear hazards you can prevent. You ensure that there is no nuclear equipment and that's it. You are taken care of it. Okay? But right, when you are running the nuclear plant, then you can't completely prevent. Then you can reduce the risk. So after prevention, once you have taken, if you can't prevent in that state, what is the second thing you can do? You can reduce. Either prevent or reduce. This is mitigation. And what can you prevent or reduce? You can prevent or reduce or mitigate the hazard. Okay? What is hazard? Now go to the word. Hazard is the event having the potential. So you can reduce the event's potential to cause damage. This is mitigation. Right? Mitigation means the reduction of the potential of the event to cause damage, either by eliminating it or by reducing it. This is mitigation, right? And preparedness means in reducing the vulnerability and increasing the capacity of the community to overcome it. Once you have done this, what have you achieved? Risk reduction. And what is this approach? The progressive approach to disaster management. What are you doing here? Are you preparing or are you taking action after the disaster? Do you reduce or prevent the disaster after the disaster? So this you are doing before the disaster, right? Do you reduce the vulnerability of the community before, after the disaster? No, you do it before. This capacity increase also you do before. So in this, you are taking all these three actions before the disaster, right? And hence it is a proactive approach to disaster management or a pre-disaster approach, right? It includes a pre-disaster component also. Okay, that one was including only a post-disaster. Hence it was only relief. Relief किसको दोगे? जिसके साथ कुछ गड़बड़ हुआ है, ठीक है? एंड रिस्क किसका रिड्यूस करोगे? जिसके साथ डिजास्टर हो सकता है. Do you get it? So this is the difference between the two approach. That assumes कि पहले हो जाने दो, उसके बाद कुछ कर देंगे. This says होने नहीं देंगे. Do you get it? Simply said, right? मतलब it might sound like a very strong statement in Hindi, but it simply means preventing the disaster to happen. ठीक है? So this is the broad difference between the two approach, right? So for this approach, the progressive approach, you have a latest number also. सबसे पहले क्या try? What should we try? हाँ, सबसे पहले क्या करना चाहिए? Mitigate करना चाहिए या prepare करना चाहिए? पहले तो mitigate. पता चला you prepared a community for a disaster and then you were able to completely prevent it. तो बेकार में उतना एफर्ट किया, हाँ, प्रिपेयर भी कर दिया एंड प्रिवेंट भी कर दिया. सो फर्स्ट यू नीड टू मिटिगेट, सी व्हाट ऑल यू कैन प्रिवेंट एंड सी व्हाट ऑल यू कैन रिड्यूस. दैट विल गिव यू द वल्नरेबिलिटी एंड द कैपेसिटी related actions required to be taken. So once you have done this, then you do preparedness. ठीक है ना? So if you go logically, right, how should we go? The first thing that you need to do is mitigate, right? And in mitigate, what should we do? First, prevent or reduce. Okay? From this, then the next thing you should do is prepare, right? Or have the preparedness. Okay? And when do you do all this? Before disaster, after disaster? So you can say this is all pre-disaster. Right? Now, once you are prepared, after that, you wait. अब और क्या कर सकते हो? Once you are prepared, you wait for the disaster, and then what can happen is the disaster. ठीक है? The disaster occurs. Once the disaster occurs, then what do you need to do? अब क्या करना पड़ेगा? You have to respond. Relief तो आपका action है, but सबसे पहले you have to respond. Respond to the disaster, right? In your response, what all will you do? सबसे पहला in response, what do you do? क्या करोगे? खुद सोचो. Let us say the disaster. You are the DM. First, you try to mitigate it, right? Some you could reduce, some you can eliminate. Then you made your community and the whole team and everything prepared. Your district is prepared for the disaster. And then you realize that, okay, one bad day or one eventful day, I should say, a disaster happens. I won't call it bad day, depends on how prepared you are, right? So it might even be a good day, so as to test कि आपने कितना preparedness किया. So one eventful day, the disaster happens, right? And then you are ready for the response, right? So you take some, you will respond to the disaster. So what will be your first response? क्या करोगे सबसे पहले? Evacuation. खाली करा दोगे? हाँ? क्या खाली कराओगे? Evaluate मतलब पेपर लेके बैठ जाएंगे? अच्छा, पहले ये देखेंगे कि हुआ क्या था, अर्थक्वेक आया है या साइक्लोन आया है, बट इतना तो पता ही होगा ना जब डिजास्टर आया है. कितना डिजास्टर हो गया आपको बैठे बैठे पता चल जाएगा कहाँ कहाँ कौन कौन मरा है. अथॉरिटीज को बोलेंगे पहले देख के आओ कौन कौन मरा है, बचाओ नहीं, बस देख के आओ. ऑफिसर जाएगा देख के आएगा आपके यहाँ कितने मरे, कौन कौन बचा हुआ है बचाने के लिए. ऐसा करेंगे? सोचो सोचो, सोचना है. मोबिलाइज द team which has done the preparedness. Okay, but did you not say that you have to involve all the stakeholders? तो mobilize कौन बचा करने के लिए? सभी तो mobilized होंगे. सोचो और सोचो. सबसे पहला टारगेट क्या होगा? What will be your first instruction to your team? Save life. Simple यार, save life, है ना? सबसे पहला, this is your target, right? Save as many lives as possible. सबसे पहला तो save life, right? And hence your response, the first thing in this is rescue. Rescue as many as possible. And क्या rescue करोगे? किसका life? हाँ, चिड़िया बत्तख बचा के ले आए, क्या बचाओगे? Right. So the first is human, affected human being, and then also उसके बाद किसको बचाओगे? कौन सा एनिमल? वाइल्ड लाइफ, डोमेस्टिक, राइट? सो यू हैव टू सेव योर डोमेस्टिक लाइवस्टॉक ऑल्सो टू द एक्सटेंट पॉसिबल. ठीक है, डिपेंडिंग ऑन व्हाट इज द डिजास्टर यू आर टॉकिंग ऑफ. ठीक है, सो रेस्क्यू, राइट, लाइफ first human and then the domestic. Reason being, many times it is seen that once the people whom you have rescued, they themselves go back to rescue their livestock, okay, and challenge themselves as well as the livestock. Okay, pehle, okay. So you have to rescue the people first, and then you also have to rescue their livestock, because they might feel, they might be attached. वो बोलेगा मुझे तो बचा के ले आए, मेरी गैया बंधी रह गई, राइट? एंड गैया माता हैज गिवन मी, you know the kind of condition we have in India right now. You know, you have more number of Gau Rakshaks than the disaster management people in India. So, है ना? So you have to ensure that you know you rescue. I hope किसी को बुरा ज़्यादा नहीं लग रहा होगा, मतलब ये नहीं कि मुझे रूम के बाहर आकर के मुझसे झगड़ा शुरू कर देना. Sir, how could you say this to my brethren Gau Rakshaks? ठीक है. So don't get emotional यार, कोई बात नहीं. कैटल रक्षक, ओके, अब ठीक है. ठीक है. So basically you have to rescue. After rescue अभी क्या करना पड़ेगा? रेस्क्यू के बाद सीधा रिहैबिलिटेट करना. क्या बोलते हैं उसको? फर्स्ट एड. ठीक है. रिलीफ इज द वर्ड. ठीक है. सो द सेकेंड थिंग इज रिलीफ, राइट? रिलीफ ऑफ वेरियस काइंड विच माइट बी रिक्वायर्ड. ठीक है. सम माइट रिक्वायर मेडिकल फैसिलिटीज, सम माइट रिक्वायर फूड, सम माइट रिक्वायर शेल्टर, सम माइट रिक्वायर क्लोथ्स. Let us say we are talking of a region which is extremely cold, the temperature is sub-zero. रात को 9 बजे आया डिजास्टर, हो सकता है खाना वो ना मांग रहे हो, ठीक है, बट दे माइट लुक फॉर क्लोथ्स और वार्म क्लोथ्स. नहीं दिया तो पता चला सुबह तक सेकेंड डिजास्टर. ठीक है. सो यू नीड टू इंश्योर दैट whatever relief is required. So this is where you have to be dynamic in terms of the requirement of the community. ये ज़रूरी नहीं है कि सबको खाना पहुंचा दिया, रात को 11 बजे डिजास्टर आया था, उसके बाद खाना की कोई ज़रूरत नहीं, सब खा के डिजास्टर हुआ. ठीक है. सो नेक्स्ट डे अगर आप 2-3 बजे तक खाना नहीं भी दोगे तो चला लेंगे, बट दे माइट रिक्वायर क्लोथ्स और अदर थिंग्स, ओके, और मेडिकल फैसिलिटी. सो दिस इज वॉट यू हैव टू relief. After the relief, what will be the next thing? Huh? After this, what you do is, now first of all, when you rescue them, where will you put them? Depends on the kind of disaster, right? So depends on the disaster, right? If it is an earthquake, you don't have to probably shift them all to a central place, because, or you have to see, right? If it is a flood situation, you have to rescue them to a high point. Right? If it is a let's say, you know, coastal cyclone kind of a thing, you have to move them to the interiors. So it depends on what kind of rescue you do. But generally, the rescue operation involves public utilities and public buildings, right? Which are generally built at places which are safe. So you generally move them to public utilities such as hospitals, schools, and all, right? But over a period, what has to be done is that once you rescue and do all this, then gradually you would also like your public services to resume. You would like your hospital to resume, you would like your schools to resume, you would like your offices to resume, because action has to be taken, right? For that, you have to move these people out of the government buildings and move them to temporary shelters, right? This is what your rehabilitation is. Rehabilitation. Right, so you rehabilitate them to some place where they can temporarily live. Okay, so these are rehabilitation centers. Right, after this, what will be your next target? Resume the normal activity course, which means you will try to resume their normal economic activity, their social activity, economic activity, all those things. Right, educational activities. Okay, so but rehabilitation centers say this might not be possible. People might not be willing to live there for long. This is where you have to do the next thing, which is recover, and all this is recovery part. From here, it's your recovery itself which has started. After your initial response, this is your recovery, right? And this will include reconstruction. What will you reconstruct? The damaged building and all. So you will reconstruct and ensure that they go back to their normal activities or normal places wherever they live or whatever. Okay, so this will be the next task, to reconstruct them or their places of living and all. Is that all right? So this is your next activity in terms of this thing, reconstruction, and all this is your recovery phase. This is where the community is trying to recover. Okay, I hope you get this. Okay? Right? Now, how strong will you reconstruct? What should be your target in reconstruction? Huh? Should you should you make the structure as good as it was before the disaster? What will be the outcome if you build it as good as it was before the disaster? Same level of disaster will put you in the same condition again. Yes or no? So what should be the target? To build back better. This is the key term, right? What you call as build back better. So reconstruction always has to be focusing on build back better. This is a key term in the disaster management, National Disaster Management Plan 2016. Build back better. Okay? Build back better means what? You have integrated in this what? Huh? The developmental approach. Right? You have developed the region to the next level by building back better. Whatever you are building, you build back better than the previous. So the whole region gets developed to the developmental approach also, because taking the or considering the disaster as an opportunity, you develop the region to the next level, right? One good case study of this is the Bhuj example. Okay, the city of Bhuj has been built back better after the Bhuj earthquake, right? So there is a good case study around this, right? So these are some examples of how your reconstruction will help. Now, what will be the good effect of build back better? Huh? What will be the effect? Next time, if a disaster of same magnitude comes, you don't have to take similar actions, right? Because your whole structure is now resilient to that level of disaster, right? And you can resume your normal course of activity as soon as the disaster gets over, right? If you are able to resume your normal course of activity as soon as the event is over, is it a disaster anymore? No. Right? You have taken care of that disastrous situation forever. Do you get? So it is no more a disaster because you have reduced the hazard potential of that event. Okay? And it will no more be a disaster. आया समझ में? Yes or no? I hope this is a simple logic that if you have reconstructed better for the next time, you are converted that disaster into a non-disaster situation, right? And the same level of event will not be any disastrous next time. Okay? And this is what you call as the developmental approach to disaster, progressive approach to disaster, right? So you use disasters so as to develop to the next level. Okay? I hope you get this, right? And this is the diagram, this thing that you have drawn, not yahan tak, I'll say, let me put the word recovery here, right? So this is the diagram of disaster management approach. Right, this much. They have not explained it, but they have just mentioned it this way. The thing, all the things that you see in that blue box, I will redraw it. So what all do you find? You have the disaster. Before the disaster, which are the stages? One is mitigation, second is preparedness. And after the disaster, the stages are, one is response and the second is recovery. right? This is the disaster management approach as given in your NDMP, National Disaster Management Plan of 2016. ठीक है? Right? So I can redraw this diagram for you if you want. What does it say? The disaster management, the progressive disaster management approach includes disaster, and before that number 2, before that 1, and this side 3 and 4, right? And this becomes a cyclic process. What comes under recovery includes your, देखो वहाँ पे, it is your reconstruction and your rehabilitation. Rehab and reconstruction includes your recovery. ठीक है? Is this all right? ठीक है? So let us say there is another older diagram for disaster management which is given in many books. Let me show you that. This is the one. This was actually given in the earlier books. थोड़ा सा ध्यान से देख लो because we have already discussed this. What does it say? This is the incidence. Before the incidence, what does it talk of? It talks of prevention, mitigation and preparedness. But this is not the new diagram for disaster management. I'll show you the new one as well. Right? And after the disaster, it talks of rescue, response, rehab and recovery. Okay, which includes reconstruction, and from there it goes again into prevention. But this is the older diagram of disaster management. The newer diagram is shown in this document, National Disaster Management Plan, which is the latest document on disaster management in India, which is published, I think, June 2016. Okay? As per this document, the disaster management, इसमें वो सब लोग दिए हुए हैं, ठीक है? इनसे पहले भी, right? But hopefully they will not ask you question about them, so you don't need to read. What you have to read here is the disaster management approach. See this. Okay? So it says this is the disaster management cycle that we have to follow. Okay? What does it say? Pre-disaster, what you have to do? First, mitigation, which includes prevention and risk reduction. Second, preparedness. Once you are able to do this, then you are ready for the disaster to occur. Once the disaster occurs, then what do you take care of? You first respond to the disaster and then you recover from the disaster. Once you recover, you are again ready for the next level of disaster. Okay? And this is your disaster management cycle. So this is what we have drawn. Okay? Because this is the logical sequence. Right? So I would assume that you have this diagram with you, mentioned as NDMP, disaster management cycle, as per the NDMP 2016. ठीक है, वो लिख करके रख लो. Wherever you want to draw or utilize, you can use that. ठीक है?
Used in any disaster management.
Yes. This is a disaster management cycle. How do you approach to a disaster? Okay. So good. Now let us come to next part. After this, the meaning of the words. Right? So what is meant by prevention, mitigation, one line about all the terms which have come here. लिख लें. Right? The technical, because they are not technical, these are simple one-liners given in the document, so I give you, otherwise you have to write it yourself. Okay, so let us just write these key terms. Right? The first is prevention. Right? Prevention means what? It's an English word. Outright avoidance. Okay? These are all simple terms. Just let's write them at one place and then be ready with. So first is outright avoidance. Second is mitigation. Mitigation means lessening or limiting the effects. Lessening or limiting the effects. Preparedness. Now this is slightly technical, so write this down. Lessening or limiting the effects was mitigation. Then preparedness. This means knowledge and capacities developed knowledge and capacities developed by all stakeholders. All stakeholders, obviously individual, community, the government organization, and professional rescue and relief organizations, right? So knowledge and capacities developed by all stakeholders to effectively, one, anticipate, two, respond, to effectively, one, anticipate, two, respond, and third, recover from the hazardous condition. So preparedness includes your anticipation also. You should be able to anticipate it, then respond to it, and finally recover from it. Okay. Then you have the next word, which is response. Response means the provision of emergency services and public assistance. Emergency services means medical facilities, and public assistance means shelter and food. Provision of emergency services and public assistance just after a disaster. Just after a disaster, with the goal of, one, saving lives, reducing health effects, two, reducing health effects, third, public safety, and fourth, subsistence needs. Fourth, subsistence needs. So these are the four goals of response. ठीक है? Saving life, reducing health effects, public safety and subsistence needs. Food, shelter, ये सब दे देंगे. Medicines and all. Okay. Then you have, after this, recovery. Recovery, which means restoration and improvement. Restoration and improvement of facilities. Restoration of facilities such as, क्या facilities होगी? Education, government offices, and for that you have to rehabilitate, because this is where you have rescued them. So you move them from such places and rehabilitate. Public services along with that, or facilities first, restoration of facilities. Second, livelihoods. Livelihood means economic activities. And living conditions. Living conditions, which means the residential facilities. Okay. So economic activities and residential facilities, livelihoods and living conditions of affected people. Affected people, along with reducing risk. Along with reducing disaster risks. Right? So this is it. This is the whole story about your disaster preparedness approach. These are the two approaches that we have to cover under your disaster management, right? Now, the theoretical aspect is taken care of. You know all the different components of it. Now what we have to do is, and I hope you remember all those questions about preparedness. right? So all those questions of preparedness we have discussed what all you have to take care of. वो मैंने बात कर लिया आपसे. How do you reduce the risk and all by improving the preparedness and all, right? Now next is what have we done for disaster management, right? Till now we were talking about the theory of disaster management, right? Now let us approach the disaster management in terms of measures taken for disaster management, right? So now we are talking of application of this measures taken for disaster management. हाँ जी, measures taken वो नहीं है. Measures taken will be which are the programs that we have done internationally, which are the programs that the government has done, what are we doing in India for disaster. These are the approach. मतलब this is the steps that you take. Now we are talking of the programs or measures, ठीक है, taken internationally or nationally. So in this first write international measures for disaster management. International measures, and after that we will come to national measures in disaster management. ठीक है. Why are we covering international measures? Your paper 3 doesn't ask you international questions. क्यों कर रहे हैं फिर भी? Because much of what we have done nationally flows from international measures, right? Those they were first suggested at international platforms, and those only we have mostly implemented in India through various measures that we have applied. So you have to understand where did they evolve. Whatever we are doing, where has it evolved? Okay, I'll just give you one simple example of this. Let us see. Right? This National Disaster Management Plan that I have shown you, see here. This is your Prime Minister's statement. मतलब फोटो नहीं देखना है उनका, ठीक है? What does it see? It incorporates the approaches enunciated in the Sendai framework of disaster management. Right? Even the Prime Minister in his very first address about the disaster management thing talks about Sendai framework. But then you have to understand what is the Sendai framework, and were there any framework before this? ठीक है? Right? So this is just one simple example, right? Then I can show you probably next उसमें है. Let me see and show. He also talks, the Home Minister, ठीक है? Then probably the next one talks further. नहीं, not in this. Let me show. यहाँ पे है in this document. The preface. This is the preface of National Disaster Management Plan. In this preface, you have 3 documents. See here. Right? Read from here. National Disaster Management Plan. There were many new developments, particularly the adoption of 3 landmark international agreements in the year 2015, having significant bearing on the disaster management. Right? So they have included all these 3 in our disaster management plan. Which are they? The Sendai framework, second, the SDGs, right? And third, the Paris Agreement on climate change. All the 3 and their implications are there on your national disaster management plan. So this is why you have to understand that which are the international developments which have affected our disaster management approach, or how have we developed our processes, or whatever things we are doing in disaster management, how have we come to this conclusion that these are the things that we need to attain, right? And this is why your international developments become important. So with this basic thing, let us come back to your international measures in disaster management. ठीक है? नहीं, not here. यहाँ पे ही लिख लेते हैं. Right? So international measures. For DM. Okay. Go on writing one by one. So which are the international efforts or measures in terms of disaster management? The first one is the IDNDR, which was for the period 1990 up to 2000. International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. IDNDR, which stands for International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction for the period 1990 to 2000. International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction for the period 1990 to 2000. Concentrating on the commitment to disaster preparedness, to disaster prevention through focus on concentrating on the commitment for disaster prevention through focus on hazard, vulnerability, risk assessment, and sustainable development. Risk assessment, sustainable development, effective early warning, technology transfer, effective early warning, technology transfer, and knowledge sharing. Right? All these things were talked of by 1990 itself. Okay? So what all is there? Hazard, vulnerability, risk assessment, ये सब कुछ हमने तभी बात कर लिया था internationally. You will find some of them coming into our documents at a later stage. Right? Gradually they have percolated to our programs and other things. Right? Right. Now write down the objective of IDNDR. What are the objectives? And some of these objectives were, as I said, later reflected in our different documents. Okay, so objectives, I will cut short the objectives by just giving you key terms. They are long, so just write down some key terms so that you can write them in your answers. For example, अगर आप कहीं लिख रहे हो risk assessment, so you can write that IDNDR in 1990 itself focused as risk assessment as one of its objectives. Okay, so this is how it will help in your answers, right? So you can write the objective. The first is national risk assessment. National risk assessment. Second, mitigation plans. Mitigation plan, including prevention, preparedness, and community awareness. Where do you find it in the latest document? In your disaster management cycle of NDMP 2016. That is the first thing. लिखा है ना वहाँ पे आपने? Mitigation is the first, including prevention and reduction. Right? It does not still include community awareness. वो वहाँ पे नहीं दिया हुआ है अभी भी. But in the international platform, they have said included community awareness. तो ये आप अपना एक suggestion के जैसा add कर सकते हो. Right? That in our mitigation plans, community awareness could also be included as suggested is IDNDR 1990-2000. This is how you highlight these points. Okay? Then come to next one. Ready access to warning systems. Ready access to warning systems from local up to global levels. ready access to warning systems from local up to global levels. Right? The best example of this is that after the tsunami of 2004, India has started sharing the tsunami warning systems information with countries such as Australia and New Zealand, and we also get information from the Alaska tsunami warning system and the Pacific tsunami warning system. So this is an example. We started implementing it after 2004, right? But it was mentioned in a earlier document itself. So these objectives have gradually been implemented. Okay, right? Now you come to the second part. So from this we come to the next one, what we call as the Yokohama strategy. Yokohama strategy. कल योकोहामा देखा था, याद है? हाँ, कहाँ पे? कहाँ? जापान में? हाँ, सबसे ऊपर जो प्लेन बनाया था आपने, क्वांटो प्लेन, याद है? क्वांटो प्लेन में यू हैड टोक्यो एंड योकोहामा, याद है? So that Yokohama this is. Okay, so Yokohama strategy which came up in 1994. Which came up in 1994 at the World Conference of Natural Disaster Reduction. World Conference of Natural Disaster Reduction. World Conference on Natural Disaster Reduction with the following objectives. ठीक है, अब इसके objectives काफी सारे हैं, but I'll just give you the key terms, right? 1, risk assessment. 2, disaster prevention and preparedness. Disaster prevention and preparedness for reducing the need for disaster relief. For reducing the need for disaster relief. What was disaster relief approach? कौन सा approach था वो? Conventional, traditional. And what is your prevention and preparedness approach? The proactive. So they are saying that by becoming proactive, you reduce the need for your conventional relief centric approach. ठीक है? Then the third is disaster prevention and preparedness to be integrated with developmental planning and policy. Rather, policy and planning. Developmental policy and planning. Next, capacity building. Capacity building. Next, early warning. Then preventive measures. Preventive measures to be made participatory. To be made participatory. What will be the benefit? If the local community participates in prevention, they know what is the response they need to take when any disaster happens. क्योंकि उन्होंने ही उसको prepare किया है, so they will be knowing that how they need to respond. Okay. Then next, reduce vulnerability. Reduce vulnerability of target groups, and which will be these groups? The ones which are more vulnerable, right? Reduce vulnerability of targeted groups, for example old age or communities which are more affected. So you reduce their vulnerability first, because not everyone is equally affected. Okay? Then next, technology transfer. From international community. Next, environmental protection. Environmental protection. This will help in prevention and mitigation. Okay? Right? Or reduction. Because it will make the system more resilient. The system will be able to take the shock. Okay? For example, if you strengthen the mangroves, what will happen? Your tsunami and tsunami and cyclone and storm surge related disasters will be reduced or mitigated. So this is how your natural vegetation helps. Okay. Then next you can write, the primary responsibility of protection lies on the with the country to protect its people. You can't say we have a disaster, you only can save us. No. The primary responsibility lies with the country itself. This is part of the Yokohama strategy. There they have this objective, that the country should be responsible for protecting its own people. It can be helped, but it cannot pass on the responsibility to others. कहाँ तक पहुँच गए हम? 1990. Then you write down the ISDR. I still have one more minute. ISDR 2000 to 2010. International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction. International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, formulated by UN. The first and this one both were formulated by UN. Even the third meet was by UN only, right? So formulated by UN, formulated by International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, formulated by UN. Yes, that was also right. Then provide global framework, so as to improve resilience, increase resilience, improve or increase resilience by focusing on the following. Focusing on following. 1. Risk management. Increase resilience by focusing on following. Resilience का मतलब क्या है? The ability of a community to withstand any situation. ठीक है? So through risk management. 1. Risk management. 2. Hazard mitigation. Risk management, hazard mitigation, and sustainable development. Right? So from here we are left with two more this thing. One is Hyogo framework for 2005 to 15, and the Sendai framework for 2015 to 30. These two we will start with tomorrow, and then we will come to the Indian measures with respect to disaster management. Okay? So here we stop for today, and let us catch up from here tomorrow. Okay? Okay, what books do you read for disaster management? देखो आपका NCERT सुन लो भाई, आप ही के लिए है, मेरा तो रिवीजन बहुत बार हो चुका है. NCERT, I think India NCERT, there is a last chapter, disaster management, in your India physical NCERT that you read, right? Apart from that, there are different documents which are there. I would not suggest you the book which I think CBSE है, इसका एक book है, which is a very old document, right? 2006 का publication है. I would not suggest it. I would rather suggest another book, training manual, published by IGNOU and NDMA. Okay, the name is Training Manual, Conceptual and Institutional Framework for Disaster Management. Right? Conceptual and Institutional Framework for Disaster Management. This is a training manual available on the NDMA website. ठीक है, PDF available है. In Conceptual and Institutional Framework for Disaster Management Training Manual, Booklet 1. I would rather suggest this was published somewhere in 2012. So this is more updated and one of the most updated as far as the basic words are given, right, and the basic concept. So I won't suggest you any other GC वो सब नहीं बोलूँगा मैं, CBSE वगैरह का book मत पढ़ो, right? Once you are done with this, then you download directly the NDMP, National Disaster Management Plan 2016. ठीक है, बस ये दो documents को कर लीजिए. Tomorrow we will talk about the other sources and which are there, guidelines वगैरह कौन कौन सा important है, we will discuss. Okay, so thank you.